Support this podcast via our Patreon and get more writerly goodness. Visit patreon.com/nanocast to join up.
Welcome to NaNoWriMo Every Month. My name is J. Daniel Sawyer. I'm the author of some 20 books, 34 short stories, and numerous articles and other things, and I am your guide on this journey to use NaNoWriMo to level up to professional output levels. Welcome to The Questions, Episode 49. Today, Caine asks, I'd love to know where your approach differs from that of other writing podcasts and why you disagree. I found those brief comments fascinating the other day. Where does your approach differ from that of Writing Excuses, The Journeyman Writer, Creative Writing Career, Wordslinger, and Author Strong? Well, Caine, I gotta admit that of those, I've only ever listened to Writing Excuses. I've put the other ones in my podcatcher, and I'll take a listen to them, but I can't comment on them. Over the years, I've listened from everything to I Should Be Writing, to The Survivor's Guide to Writing Fantasy, Ditch Diggers, to the Roundtable Podcast, the Dead Robot Society, a bunch of others here and there. I've appeared on most of those as well. And I've listened religiously to Writing Excuses. My approach differs from Writing Excuses primarily in several issues surrounding business and revisions and creativity. And please keep in mind that as I'm criticizing Writing Excuses here, this is the kid criticizing the people at the adult table in a lot of ways. First of all, I know, at least tangentially, Mary Robinette Kowal and Howard Taylor, and they're both seriously excellent people. I've had the privilege of sitting in convention bars arguing with them late into the night on one occasion or another, and I've talked to Howard on a number of other occasions. Very, very cool people. And Brandon Sanderson, of course, is one of the best-selling authors in the world. So, all of that to say, take my comments with a salt lick. I am not necessarily right. I'm opinionated. That doesn't make my opinions correct. So take it for what it's worth. I find Writing Excuses to be firmly rooted in the world that was. 10 years ago, I would have called them probably one of the best resources around for beginning writers looking to learn the craft and the business. I'm not quite so sure that's the case anymore. They're still a great resource, but there's a lot of wheat from chaff sifting that you have to do for a couple of reasons. One of them is that all of them are traditionally published writers whose entire business model is rooted in traditional publishing. At this point, none of them are doing much in the indie world. And that makes a huge difference in the sorts of constraints they're under and the sorts of priorities they have when it comes to craft, business, the law, other stuff like that. Now, they're not ignorant of indie publishing, and they have had indie writers on as guests in the past, and Howard Taylor actually does make his living as an independent comic artist and writer. And it's not a shabby living either. He knows his stuff, which is why I find it baffling that when it comes to writing his own books, prose fiction as opposed to comics, he's going through the traditional marketplace in New York. The traditional marketplace is not what it was 10 years ago. It's not what it was 15 years ago. It is very, very difficult to make a living there now. And the contracts are awful. They are so bad in terms of what rights they try to grab, how long they try to hold on to it, and what they try to pay for them, that I can't imagine going in as a newbie now. I actually declined to go in at the time when I had the opportunity because the rights grabs and the contracts were so bad. So I disagree with them fundamentally on that being a good goal to get published by New York. I think it's a stupid goal. It's one that's predicated either on an antiquated understanding of the marketplace or on a psychological need for someone else to tell you that you're good enough. And with the Writing Excuses crew, it's most certainly the former rather than the latter. With a lot of newbie writers, it's almost certainly the latter rather than the former. It's just not smart business for the career-minded writer. Now, if you're wanting to write a book here and there as a hobby over the course of your life and you don't want to have the responsibility of maintaining their presence in the marketplace, then New York is the kind of situation that's fine for you. You're not building a career, you're not going to be exploiting the copyright and working with the properties that you create, you're just going to be creating them and leaving them alone, then selling it all on to someone else who's got a business that deals in that sort of thing. That's not a bad option. But this podcast is done from the point of view of a career-minded writer trying to help other writers who are interested in developing a full-time, long-term, profitable writing career at a high level of craft. If that's what you're interested in, at this point in history, New York is a bad bet. The kinds of things that float across the wire services like last year or the year before when Andy Weir took The Martian, which was incredibly successful and profitable and made a deal with, I think it was Warner Books for it. Unless the movie deal was contingent upon that contract, and I don't know if it is, or why he wouldn't try to negotiate that away if it was, I can't imagine how that would ever be a good deal. Yes, there are certain things that New York has the ability to do that you don't automatically do as an independent publisher and you have to sort of work into, like accessing trade channels so you can get reviews in Publishers Weekly and things like that. And indie can do that, it just takes more time and effort because you have to establish yourself as a publishing house rather than just self-publishing your stuff. And you have to learn that end of the publishing business. And that's a learning curve, and that will take some time. Another thing the Writing Excuses crew is almost universal on is the value of agents. And I feel like a stereotype saying this because some of my best friends are agents. They're not. But I do have a couple of acquaintances who I think very highly of as people and business people who are agents. But agents have no business function in the current world. None. There's just no reason for them. And they cost too much, and the business model for them is bad. You're basically paying someone who's doing day labor for you with perpetual royalties. And that's a bad idea, especially when there's not a lot they're doing for you. They're not allowed to practice law, even though many of them do, because they're not lawyers. And you can't or shouldn't be taking legal advice from them if you've got an agent with a legal department, because even if they do, they've got a conflict of interest. They shouldn't be advising you because they're the lawyer for the firm. And the firm's job is to turn contracts over as quickly as possible for as little resources as possible in order to bring money into the firm. So they don't have an interest in protecting your rights and making sure you get the best contract. They're interested in the size of the advance and perhaps the size of the royalties. And a contract is so much more than the money. Agents of any sort are a dubious proposition at best just because of the inherent conflicts of interest in the position. And you can read up on this. There's a chapter on real estate agents in Freakonomics, which explains the different incentive structure an agent has from a buyer or seller in a real estate transaction. Those same economic rules apply to agents in the arts and in other businesses. Dealing with agents is generally a bad idea if you can avoid it. The number of horror stories, even from really reputable agencies run by very decent people, are unbelievable. And having an agent dealing with your business is also bad practice as a writer because it keeps your head out of your business game. And if you're trying to build a career, that's death. Long term, you're either not going to survive or you're going to get screwed over pretty big and hopefully learn a lesson or two. So that's another way that I vehemently disagree with the Writing Excuses crew. Now, on the subject of revisions, this is actually an artifact of their immersion in the traditional world. But all of them at least use the kind of language you come across in college literature courses with regards to revision and polishing and multiple drafts and extensive outlining. And there's nothing wrong with that inherently, but I think that it gives an impression of the way creativity works that can really get in the way of particularly newer writers who aren't settled in their process, because there's something very prescriptive about the way that they talk about it. And I know that at least Brandon Sanderson can't mean what he seems to mean when he talks about some of this stuff. Because Brandon is not a self-second-guessing slacker, and Dave Farland certainly doesn't train people to be perpetually second-guessing themselves and revising and polishing stuff to death. Nonetheless, the language they use can really lead one into a forest of self-second-guessing and failure and perfectionism, and I've got a problem with that, as you can tell from the rest of the podcast, where I'm always preaching against revising too much, or indeed revising at all when you've got a option about it. And the truth is that I will go back and take second shots at things and occasionally do multiple drafts on projects that require it, but it took me years and years to learn the difference between multiple drafts that are occasionally required in complex books and that are very useful in certain situations, and the kind of endless revisioning that takes so many young writers down and kicks them out of the game permanently. Or does the terrible thing of taking a writer who is amazing and arresting their career for 10 years while they work on the great book, the first book that they're doing, and they want to make it right, so they keep going over it and over it. I know one very successful author who wasted the first 10 or 15 years of his career on a book like that never sold, and that now that he has it up independently doesn't move a bit, and it's the book of his heart. But he basically revised his own voice out of the book, and it doesn't sell like the other stuff he writes sells. And that decade is time that we lost more books from this author that will never be written because he was stuck in that quagmire. And the way the Writing Excuses crowd talks about revision and editing contributes to the mindset that leads to that quagmire. The third major way I disagree with them is in the way they approach politics interacting with their fiction. I do not believe that political concerns have any business in the creative department of your brain. You may have an idea that's motivated by a political question, or you may have a character who is obviously jumping into political hot water, like, for example, Suave Rob, my far-future transsexual Evel Knievel who surfs a supernova. Rob's very existence is sort of guaranteed to make some people uncomfortable, and the way he approaches his existence even more so. And I've got books like Down from 10, which are deeply political all the way through. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is proscribing and limiting your creative vision based upon political concerns of the moment. This pops up a lot in Writing Excuses, particularly anytime a subject involving feminism or racism or any of the currently popular hot-button issues come up. There's a great deal of attention on sensitivity and being aware of your privilege as a white author, because everyone on the podcast is white, and being careful about cultural appropriation and all that sort of stuff. And I just think that's an inappropriate set of concerns when you're worrying about doing a good creative product that will move people and connect with them. When you write to a political agenda, any political agenda, you're neutering your creative voice and you're constraining it radically to the concerns of the moment in which it's written. Now, this might not be a problem with contemporary fiction, but if you're writing historical fiction and you're not being at least somewhat honest about the views and language and racism and sexism and whatnot in the period of history and the people that you're writing about, well, you're not really writing historical fiction. You're writing contemporary fiction with people in costume. And that kind of stuff just doesn't have the flavor of the era it's set in. Part of being a writer, part of telling stories, involves taking risks. If you're doing your job, sooner or later you're going to offend someone. And you don't have to be out looking to do it in order to do it. I know one author who's very successful writing incredibly sweet-hearted, very chaste, light romance. And I like this person a lot. And the existence of her entire genre offends me, because it is so desperately inoffensive that it makes me despair for the future fortitude of the culture. because one of the things you have to do as an adult is you have to deal with offensive things. Now, I understand that escapist literature is popular, and on a philosophical level, I've got no problem at all with the kind of stuff she writes. It's something that people like, and if it's something that people like, I think someone ought to write it. But personally, I read that kind of story, and I just squirm inside. It feels so artificial to me, and it upsets me that someone so intelligent has written something so vapid. And if I were of a different temperament, that's the kind of thing that people go to war on social media about. Life is full of things that offend people and upset people, and the loudest people in the room in any given culture war are never going to be representing the majority. They're always a vocal minority. That's how culture wars work. And one of the things writing excuses does that really tweaks me and that I think is really destructive to creativity is it gives a large voice to the notion that you should be worried about the things that the world tells you should be concerned about when you're sitting in your chair writing fiction. I personally don't think it's healthy to have the world's current political crises looking over your shoulder and prescribing what you should say or censoring you when you're thinking about using language that's appropriate to a period or a character that isn't appropriate to say in polite conversation. My approach to creativity is very Nietzschean. I think that creativity has to be fostered and championed, and that if what a creative person does or says offends you, then you should argue back, or even better, you should make your own creative thing to prove the point that their point of view is inferior. I don't think you should silence them, and I certainly don't think you should silence them proactively by educating them through shame, whether it's overt aggressive shaming or whether it's mixed in with genuine concern and compassion. Shame is antithetical to the creative enterprise. The entire struggle around being creatively bold is exercising shame from your writing desk, and I think it is destructive to be bringing the shame that's flinging around in the outside world into your writing office. That stuff belongs outside in the real world where culture wars matter. In your fiction writing office, that stuff doesn't matter. What matters is the story that you're telling and the passion that you bring to the project. You can worry about the rest of the stuff when you're getting ready to publish. So those are some of the ways I disagree with the writing excuses crowd in particular. Other writing podcasts that I've heard that are geared for self-publishers tend to focus a lot on aspects of business that are transitory, chasing the latest fad, how to write in this genre or that genre, how to game the system, how to structure all your projects so they funnel down and create sales. Some of those things are transitory and stupid, some of them are really smart, but all of them are things that need to happen after you write. And so often many other podcasts will talk about product development and marketing as something you need to do before you even sit down to write. And I think that's wrong. I think you need to write what it is that you want to write, and then once it's done, you hand it off to the publisher side of your office, and they figure out how to create the product funnels, and they figure out how to package it and market it. And if it's not something that fits in a product funnel or whatnot, they figure out how to make it its own thing, even if it's going to drop on the market and sit there because nothing else is pointing at it. That's your publisher's problem. Your problem as a writer is to be courageous and write with all the passion and drive you can muster. Because that is what makes a great story, and that's what emboldens you to have the courage to become a better writer every time you sit down. So for what it's worth, like I said, take it with a salt lick or two. But that's me. Anyway, I'll see you tomorrow. NaNoWriMo Every Month is written and presented by J. Daniel Sawyer and produced by Artistic Whispers Productions. Visit our website at NaNoWriMoEveryMonth.com and leave a tip in the tip jar or join the Patreon to support this podcast. NaNoWriMo Every Month is copyright 2016 by J. Daniel Sawyer and Artistic Whispers Productions and is released under a Creative Commons Non-Commercial Attribution No Derivatives license.